I'm Suze McCormick, and I'm a partner at Morrison and Foerster in San Francisco.
I am Patty Brennan. I am a partner at Morgan Lewis and Bacchius in the New York office.
We were nominated for our work for the California Rebuilding Fund. I was a founding member of CASE, which is the California Small Business Association that put together the $1 billion California Rebuilding Fund for the benefit of small business, particularly Black and Brown owned businesses in our poorest areas, our most under-resourced areas in California.
The project that I spearheaded, which I believe the way I saw the write-up, it was the one that came first was New York Forward Loan Fund Trust, which was a collaboration with New York State as well as New York State-based CDFIs, which are community development financial institutions, and commercial banks and philanthropic institutions. This fund kicked off, I think I received the first phone call from Calvert, and the thinking behind it and the structuring thinking started in, I think it was actually right after quarantine started in last week of March. The guidelines were, the governor wanted to announce no later than the opening, which he had kind of targeted Memorial Day weekend for that announcement. And he did actually announce it that weekend. So we kicked off the end of March with nothing other than a thought, and we got it structured and committed by Memorial Day. It was the first of the big COVID relief funds. And this one was targeting, basically leveraging the CDFI access to our target areas where the money was really needed. It was folks that basically didn't really have an ability to access the PPP funds that the federal government was handing out. They didn't have access to those kinds of financial institutions. So these neighborhood financial institutions were able to tap into that. And I think through the date hereof, they've received well over 100,000 applications for that money.
And I'll just add, we started around the same time. We actually started, CASE was formed the second week of March. We brought Calvert in a little bit later in the process. We, instead of, I think a distinction between California and New York is New York started with a lot of state support. We started more on the private side with volunteers who recognized exactly the same funding gap that Patty pointed out, that the federal dollars were not going to the businesses in our under-resourced areas. So it was very much of a bottoms-up approach in terms of working with the CDFIs and small business. And we put together a syndicate and a platform to allow CDFIs from all over the state. We actually have over 20 different CDFIs. This is community development and financial institutions who are participating and making loans to basically the underserved communities. We came up with a structure different from New York Forward. Instead of bundling and selling the loans, or instead of setting up a fund, we actually came up with a PBLLC under a public charity. The idea was we could set it up very, very quickly at very, very low cost, so that we could pass through funds from philanthropic donors, from financial institutions, and from, in our case, the cities, the municipalities, the state, aggregate all of those funds so that we could make very low interest loans to the communities, to the businesses in the communities that were hit the hardest.
The size of these loans, to give you a sense of the folks that we're reaching, the maximum loan is 100,000 under New York Forward. The typical loan is more in the $30,000 to $35,000 range. Another big component of New York Forward was small landlords, to help them get through the COVID and the rules that New York State put in place. You couldn't evict you can't evict a tenant during COVID for non-payment of rent. So there was money out there to help them. Right now, we're doing an amendment now to allow some of those folks that didn't tap into what was fully available to actually go back to the trough, if you will, to go back, and actually the CDFIs are going back out to borrowers that may need more help during the recovery phase that we're in now. So that's going on right now, that amendment to get those folks more money to get through this next phase. And then the next thing is New York Forward 2.0. And I think you're doing another one in California as well, Suze, right? The CDFIs, they weren't used to the support, frankly, that they're getting now. They were predominantly funded by federal funds. And they are really making an impact in the local community, where they always strove to do that. They just didn't have the capital to do it. And these structures are actually allowing them to actually get that money out there and get it to work.
It's bolstered by philanthropic and government money, so we can get, an interest rate around 4%, 5%. The comparative is, payday lenders or fintech companies, which are, at the low end, maybe 15 up to 30, 50, much higher. So these are very low interest rate loans. We're not, in California, it's not a new fund. We set up this platform again for efficiency. It can have, it can aggregate capital from hundreds of sources over time. We don't have to set up a new fund. We can just have a closing with a different bunch of group of lenders, which is what we are now moving to, a second closing on the platform, again, to get more, because there has been demand. In California, there's also been, through the government, a grant program. And so we are closely coordinating on the grant program, because there's been a couple $2 billion. And the idea is the grant program is obviously a stopgap, but the grants are even smaller than the loans. These are 10, 20,000, 5 to 20, 25,000. That keeps them sort of in business for a period of time, and did through the worst of it. And then these very low interest rate loans then help the companies really rebuild, help the companies to be able to get back on their feet, so that we can rebuild. One of the reasons that we focused on this was, if you look at our poorest, it's close to 20% of Californians right now are living in poverty. And in most of the under-resourced areas around the states, the only people that are going to be hiring in those areas are these small business. So it is a way of really providing the kind of support. Is really the most effective way to provide the support that is needed in these communities, to provide jobs and wages and opportunities for people to lift themselves out of poverty. It's a story of two different worlds. In terms of what's happening kind of on the ground. The stock market's going well, so the lawyers and the bankers are doing great, and everybody else is really, really suffering. One of the differences, and I think it's neither good nor bad, it's just a difference of approach. In some states, New York, for example, if you have the state that is driving, or you have large funders or large banks that are driving initiatives, you can have a top-down approach. And I think funding can happen faster. California, we had a very bottoms-up approach. So the case was a bunch of volunteers. So the program was designed by the CDFIs and small business. And then we worked our way up to, it was after case was launched that in fact the government, the state of California, came up with 75 million in first loss capital. And then we went out and raised. And interestingly, the philanthropic capital was relatively easy to raise. The banking capital, because it is a new structure, because we were not bundling and selling the loans, that was, I would say, the most difficult piece of it. I could sort of constantly remind people of 2008, giving lending institutions a security interest or collateral in bundled loans is not something that we think it works for in the best interest of the small business, that they could have any enforcement right against the underlying business. But that was also probably the stickiest point for the banks to get comfortable with the fact that it was an on-lending structure, where the banks were lending in to a pooled vehicle, and that vehicle was the borrower, and they didn't have recourse directly against the CDFIs and the underlying small business. So a little more difficult at first, but as a result, you have more protections for small business and more means of repaying if there are delays or companies can't make the interest payments. They're more, it's a structure that's designed to handle those kinds of issues.
So interesting that you say the commercial banks were a little bit challenging. We in New York Forward, we did not find the commercial lenders, given that the projection was they would have a loss. And, the projections are that, unfortunately, not every small business that is helped through these programs will ultimately survive. So the expectation is that there is a loss, and what the state of New York provided was a small, compared to the amount of capital that we were getting from the philanthropic entities and the banks, a very small piece that was then used as a reserve to back up some of those losses. But the banks came in knowing that there was a potential loss.
Say we have a 30, yeah. we assumed a 30% default rate.
Yeah, exactly.
Very similar, very similar again, and making sure, again, this is one of the reasons I think it's really important is I got involved in this. My true north is climate. I got involved in this because I believed that there was going to be a climate event that impacted these communities. And so I was kind of ready, beginning of March, when things started shutting down, we were ready to kind of step in. We provided a lot of support in addition to that in terms of, biweekly office hours to small business and a resource guide that Berkeley now holds. And then we got into the fund business sort of by accident because we reached out to the CDFIs and we said, hey, we have all these resources. And they said, we need money. And nobody else in the state of California was working to get all of the CDFIs together on one platform to assist with the fundraising that they needed. And so we kind of stepped into a gap. It wasn't intentional, but we stepped into that gap.
And I guess another thing to mention that has come out of these two very high profile funds is that it actually has stimulated other funds. So we've been working on a number of them since last summer. A couple of them have actually closed or are closing. We have a 14-state fund called Tsoi that is definitely another baby of New York Forward in California, kind of best practices that were learned there. And that closed early spring. And that is the southern states, and it starts up in Maryland and goes all the way down the eastern seaboard and then across as far as Texas. And there's CDFI, a lot of CDFIs in that one, because there are multiple CDFIs for every state. And that was complex, because there was potentially government money from various states. And that one was very interesting and driven more by CDFIs, Sue's to something you mentioned earlier, than anyone else in the capital structure. The state of Washington, also, we have one that should be closing shortly, and its focus is the state of Washington, also driven by a CDFI. So I think California and New York together have given birth to this whole COVID recovery fund program, it literally coast to coast. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see a national program.
COVID was the first and the catalyst, but these new structures, and particularly when you have a platform, again, not a fund because of all the costs associated with being a fund and an RIA and not bundling and selling the loans, but this really very efficient way to aggregate capital with a PBLLC under a public charity is, I know, being discussed at Treasury, and I think for a long time will be a viable alternative and means of aggregating all different types of capital to help small business and individuals. It's being used some for individuals as well as we go through a lot of events to come. I mean, COVID is just the first, but I think particularly with climate change, we're going to see increasing pressure on these businesses and the need to step in to help.
So we were first contacted by Calvert in March with a concept, and how do we do this? So I pulled together a team of finance lawyers, obviously, because ultimately we knew that there was going to be a significant financing portion to this, but also the structured finance people, our securitization folks, which really drove ultimately that final structure. Critical also was, there was a component, that the borrower of in this fund structure could, no one wanted this borrower on their balance sheet. This structuring, this financing had to be off balance sheet. So we involved in that case, because there were a lot of nonprofits involved in our structure as well. We have a tax group that does, straight corporate tax, but we also have a nonprofit tax group. So they were very involved in the structuring as well. The structuring, once we had the structure, which probably took 4 weeks to really nail it down, the documentation flowed from that.
And it was a little different in California. The California case was actually formed by me and by my client and next door neighbor. So it started with 3 of us, and we added people in. And we had probably been going for 2 months before we engaged Calvert actually and hired them to help us on the fundraising side. So in California with Case, it was started kind of, the lawyers were in coming up with the concept. We were actually well over our skis by the time we got Calvert. We were negotiating with the banks. We structured it, but we were on the front line fundraising philanthropically with the banks and in structuring. And in structuring, we started with, whenever you aggregate funds, aggregate and pool funds, are there RIA rules? And so securities lawyers were involved. Number one, corporate lawyers like me were involved in kind of how do we do this? And I had been thinking about how you do this most efficiently. What is the most efficient low cost vehicle to use here? Because a fund is one permanent asset vehicle, trusts. We actually examined, PBLLC, which is where we ended up, kind of a large, what type of corporate entity do we want to aggregate the funds? We used government contracting lawyers to figure out to structure it so we could take local, state, county, city, state, federal funding and add that to it. Then we, the lending and compliance part of it was incredibly important because most people are not allowed to reverse discriminate. You actually can't designate when you're lending to whom, that you want a certain proportion going to, businesses owned by folks of color. Very important. Nonprofit tax as well, very important, because we were dropping a pass-through entity under a public charity.
We have a big nonprofit tax group. I didn't mean to give short shrift to the rest of our team. And I love the fact, I think there is a product here that will last, will survive this, especially for the CDFIs, because of the feedback I'm hearing, through Calvert and directly, because a lot of CDFIs are now actually initiating these funds, is that, they really feel like they're finally getting to the communities that they're meant to reach.
I would say lawyers' sort of moral obligation when these things hit to really work together to come up with the best solutions, because there isn't one mousetrap. It really is a collaborative process.
That's the word that popped in my head, Suze. It was very much a collaborative process and continues to be. So it's wonderful.